What's happening, everyone? Today I wanted to do a video on Egoraptor's latest Sequelitis, which, if you don't know, is a series of videos in which Egoraptor, who is known for the Game Grumps as well as the Awesome series, takes an older game in a well-known video game franchise and he compares them to the newer installments of the same game franchise and explains where they went wrong in straying away from the game mechanics, basically the formula of the older games. Now, older Sequelitises were pretty straightforward. It's obvious to most people that there's something wrong with Castlevania 2. They just can't put into words what exactly is wrong with it in a precise way compared to the original. And Egoraptor did a pretty good job explaining that. What went wrong with it? Why is it not as satisfying as the original? And people, agreed with this for the most part. But when we get into a game that's much more complicated and frankly isn't hated by almost anybody, such as Ocarina of Time, now you get into a scenario in which personal preference and bias starts to shine through these videos and really demonstrates that, okay, maybe there's nothing wrong here, it's just a different play style than you're used to, something you don't prefer to the older games. That doesn't mean it's flawed, it just means you prefer the older games. And there's nothing wrong with that. I do think there's something wrong with presenting it as if this is a problem when it's really not a problem. To give you an example, if I was a fan of the 2D GTA games and I went and played GTA 3 and I hated it, it wouldn't really be fair to say they got all of this wrong because it doesn't feel like the older GTA games. Because it's 3D, it's completely different. They couldn't have made it exactly like the older GTA games because it's a different medium. 3D games operate very differently than 2D games. You can't take A Link to the Past and translate it perfectly into 3D. First of all, and I hate using this word, but cinematic. Cinematic. You cannot do a cinematic game like Ocarina of Time in 2D. So sure, you can point to the cutscenes and call them slow compared to A Link to the Past, but you'd be missing the point entirely. They're meant to be slow. They're meant to be atmospheric. They're meant to be building something more, a lore around the world, an atmosphere. I think I said that before. But you can't do that in 2D. It's a different style of game, and it's not a flaw. You can't present it as a flaw. You may not prefer it, but it's not a flaw. It would be like bashing Toy Story for not being as fast-paced as the Lego Movie, for instance. Yes, they're the same genre, they're the same type of animated film, but they're going for completely different styles. And you can't fault them for doing things differently if they do what they do differently well and it's intended. Again, you can have your personal preference, but you can't say that one is flawed just because it's not like the other. I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of the 2D Zelda games. I much prefer the 3D Zelda games. That being said, I can't find any real huge flaws with the 2D games. I just happen to like how they approached the 3D games more. And I'll give you some examples. I liked the slow world building in Ocarina of Time. I liked when I played the game, I immediately felt like I was in this bigger world than the 2D Zelda games. Because it was more immersive. It was bigger. It felt more epic. It was a living, breathing world with a much better narrative, in my opinion. And the gameplay was just awesome. It was unlike any other 3D game I had played before it. And this is very important. Context. In this video, he complains about things that by today's standards are valid complaints. But back then, they were not, because no other game was doing it better. No other game was even trying to do what Zelda was doing. It was a first. So how can you really compare it to something that doesn't exist? Yes, he's comparing it to the 2D Zelda game, A Link to the Past, But again, it's apples and oranges. They're completely different play styles. One of them is intended to be a little bit faster paced, and one of them is intended to be a little bit more slow and atmospheric, as well as cinematic, etc. There's subtleties to Ocarina of Time that you simply cannot do in a 2D game. Or rather, you could do them, but they wouldn't come across very well. But they had an opportunity to do something different in Ocarina of Time, and they did it well. You couldn't have a set piece as epic as the final battle against Ganondorf in A Link to the Past. It simply wouldn't be possible. We can sit back and talk about what Ocarina of Time doesn't do quite as well as modern games, but that's kind of fucking stupid. Ocarina invented a lot of the things that future games evolved. Of course they're more refined. They had years to work on it. Every 3D Zelda game improves on the last in terms of gameplay. And yes, I'm including Skyward Sword, because if you aren't a total spaz, the motion controls work as intended. Now, would the motion controls work in a 2D Zelda game like A Link to the Past? Of course not. They're completely different, and that's a good thing. They're progressing the series, taking full advantage of the hardware, not stuck in the past, but evolving. They execute what they set out to do extremely well. You may not prefer it to the older games, but they're not flawed just because they aren't trying to shoehorn in the mechanics of a 2D game like A Link to the Past into completely different 3D games that are so different that they even have separate fan bases. They have just as many differences as they do similarities. But if the question is asking if Ocarina of Time is a masterpiece, then the answer is yes, for different reasons than A Link to the Past being a masterpiece. And that should be enough. Let the two different groups of people enjoy the games without criticizing the others for not being exactly the same. Anyway, that's just my random, unsorted thoughts on the matter. Leave a comment and tell me how I'm wrong.